Happy to talk with you all. We're being recorded. Hope that's all right with everyone. It's all right with me. So I just wanted to mention too that I actually grew up in San Mateo County in Foster City and haven't lived there for a while, but really happy to know there's an active branch of peace action and hope to connect with all of you more. And this is a great way to get that started. So I was just going to talk a little bit more about Tri-Valley Cares. We celebrated our 40th anniversary last year, started in 1983, literally around a dining table of some folks who were concerned both about nuclear weapons writ large and about the impacts that developing nuclear weapons at the local laboratory might have on the community, which at that time, still the facility, Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, still operated under extreme secrecy, and there was very little known about any releases to the environment during their operations, which date back all the way to 1952 when it originally opened. And the community was concerned and wanted to start a group both to uh, actively oppose nuclear weapons and also uh, try to find out more about the kind of impacts they might be enduring as a community. And my, did they end up finding out a lot? I'll touch on some of that. Um, but I also wanted to, for anyone who might not know much about Lawrence Livermore National Lab, say a little bit about what it is and what it is not. So Livermore Lab is one of the United States' two nuclear weapons research and design laboratories. The other one, perhaps being more famous, especially after the Oppenheimer film chronicled its beginnings, which is Los Alamos National Lab in New Mexico. But Livermore was started, kind of the story goes, to compete with Los Alamos in the development of thermonuclear weapons, which are the more modern weapons that are dual state and much more powerful than the weapon chronicled in the Oppenheimer film. And that competition was successful. The thermonuclear weapons were developed by 1955 at both sites with different designs. And I just mentioned that because to some extent that history endures in that Livermore continues to develop and modernize the designs that it initially developed, some of which date all the way back to the 1950s. And Los Alamos continues to develop and modernize the weapons that it developed back in those times. Their customer is the Department of Defense, specifically the Air Force and the Navy, which are the two entities that have custody of nuclear weapons. Livermore does not produce nuclear weapons. It is not a production site. It's just a research and development site. There is also no nuclear power plant in Livermore. I'm often surprised with young people. I start talking about nuclear weapons and they respond with questions about nuclear power. And there's, I think, been confusion, especially because of the Iran deal being part of their narrative about nuclear weapons, yet about highly enriched uranium and their nuclear energy program. So I just like to clarify both that Livermore doesn't have a nuclear energy program and that Tri-Valley Cares does not have a firm program around nuclear energy. We are an anti-nuclear weapons organization, and we challenge nuclear weapons development and new nuclear weapons development and buildup of the stockpile. There is a way in which those two things are connected. There's several ways, but the one we're engaged with is in waste, because the Department of Energy does have ultimate responsibility for commercial spent nuclear fuel. And so there's some ways in which we chime in around nuclear waste issues where some of that waste is from commercial nuclear fuel. But I won't get into that level of detail. Just want to clarify what our portfolio is. Uh, so Livermore Lab is also actually two sites. There's the main site, which is 1 square mile in Livermore. It's got houses and parks and a little league field and wineries built right up to the gates of that 1 square mile. It's a unique site. Los Alamos is more than 35 square miles. Most of the other nuclear sites in the country have sizable buffer zones. Livermore does not. And 90,000 people now live in the city of Livermore, and 7 million live in the 50-mile radius acknowledged by the Department of Energy to be the impacted zone if there were to be a large-scale accident or a terrorist attack at Livermore Lab, including some of San Mateo County. The other site is called Site 300, and that's actually out in the hills beyond Livermore near Tracy, California. And that is a high explosives testing range where Livermore Lab tests high explosives. And it was just in the news last week because a wildfire started there and burned some of the site, including several areas where they are doing active cleanup of contaminated groundwater. So a cleanup facility burned down, as well as some storage facilities that may have had waste in them, probably chemical waste, but we are investigating that. But just wanted to mention it in case people heard that last week. It's called the Corral Fire. And then the last thing I want to say about Livermore Lab specifically is that it's actually just finished a site-wide environmental impact statement review, which is a planning document for the next 15 years of operation. And that planning document plans for a massive expansion of Livermore Lab. They're going to tear down close to 150 buildings and rebuild with 75 or so new larger facilities. They're doubling down on nuclear weapons work, and they're undergoing a major hiring spree. They're developing several new warheads right now and have plans for more. They're getting involved in supporting the new production of nuclear weapons that is going to happen, and something I'll talk about more. They'll be in a support role for that, but it is very alarming to Tri-Valley Cares and to the people in Livermore, and should be to all of us, that our current nuclear posture. Another way to say that is our posture is nuclear weapons forever.
Sorry,
So,
Scott, can you repeat that last line? You kind of froze, and I think we
sure.
missed what you said.
I said our posture is nuclear weapons forever. We are undergoing a massive build out across the country at nuclear facilities to support long-term nuclear weapons development and a larger and more highly developed or technologically developed stockpile. So I was going to just say a little bit about the environmental impact too, which has been fairly severe at Livermore. We have a contaminated groundwater plume, so contains both chemical and toxic stuff has gotten into the groundwater, as well as radionuclides. So it's a mixed situation in the groundwater. There have been major releases, including one of the largest releases of tritium gas, which is a radioactive hydrogen gas that happened in 1969, but heavily contaminated the community at that time. We've had many accidents from fires and criticalities, and many dangerous things happen there, and they continue to happen. Just in 2021, there was a facility fire at Site 300 where an experiment exploded, contaminated 36 employees, and released toxic smoke into the air for several hours. So I just offer this as a rebuttal to Livermore Lab's posture or public relations campaign, which really draw a picture of a very safe site. If you look at their public relations, it's actually hard to tell that they're doing nuclear weapons development, despite the fact that it's over 85% of their budget. I mentioned the hiring spree that they're doing, and they've actually been hiring at universities, including our local community college, and students have been counter recruiting and protesting because both Livermore Lab has developed some conventional weapons being used in Gaza that is making students very frustrated, and because the way in which Livermore Lab represents itself at jobs fairs is very misleading. I was gonna just screen share the budget so that people could see. This is a pie chart of Livermore Lab's current budget. I know the type is small there, but you can see the bulk of it is for nuclear weapons activities. And this is actually their request for fiscal year 2025. They have some other programs, including an energy efficiency and renewable energy program that we'd love to see them do more with, but they're only 0.7% of the budget is for renewable energy. If you go to their website, renewable energy is one of the things they highlight on their website, 0.7% of the budget. So part of our work is truth telling about what Livermore Lab really is, what it really does. They would prefer not to have that narrative out in the public, so we're challenging that. All right, I'll stop that share. It was mentioned that Tri-Valley Cares just returned from Washington, D.C., and we were there with an organization called the Alliance for Nuclear Accountability that we are a part of. It's made up of several dozen organizations that are all in the shadow of a nuclear facility. So Nuclear Watch New Mexico near Los Alamos, Oak Ridge Environmental Peace Alliance near Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Savannah River Site Watch near Savannah River, South Carolina, etc. We gathered and we had over 60 meetings with members of Congress and administrative officials. And I wanted to just report out briefly about that. I was going to also share some of our, I think I would go, one sec, let me see here. Some of our priorities from that, which looks like this. There we go. So our focus in the meetings was to stop some new warhead programs, specifically some that are happening at Lawrence Livermore National Lab, to stop new bomb plants from moving forward that both cost a huge amount of money, will inevitably have a serious environmental impact, and are behind schedule and have major contract oversight problems. We also brought up in meetings rule of law around nuclear disarmament, specifically the Non-Proliferation Treaties, Article 6, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I mentioned oversight and accountability or a problem with contractors. So we had some specific asks around oversight and accountability at nuclear weapon sites. It's a difficult situation in Washington, D.C. for many reasons, one being that it's an election year. But I wanted to show you guys this, and this is from a report that we have that's available on the Tri-Valley Cares website, and I'm happy to share that report. I can put it in the chat, but it's something that can be fodder for any meeting anyone wants to have with their member of Congress, or you can send it to your member, whether that's Anna Eshoo or I forget the other San Mateo County congressperson's name. We did not meet with that person. He's fairly new, I believe.
Kevin Mullen.
That's it, Kevin Mullen. So please send it on. I'll put it in the chat in a bit. I wanted to talk about specifically the two warheads being developed at Livermore, and they're on here. And I'm going to talk about why they're especially proliferation provocative. First, I'll mention the W80-4. The W80-4 nuclear warhead is actually being developed for the long-range standoff cruise missile that is going on bombers, on airplanes. And it's fairly far along in its development. But 2 years ago, in response to the threats from China of increasing their arsenal, Republicans in the House mainly brought back an idea for a new sea-launched cruise missile that would be launched out of submarines. So it would be a missile that was launched and then could hug the ocean and be used really as a first strike weapon that would evade radar, similar to the long-range standoff warhead. So I mentioned that because we already have this capability in airplanes, but it's a very dangerous weapon. It's something that George H.W. Bush took out of the stockpile in 1991, but Congress is grasping at ways to beef up our nuclear posture in response to Russia and China. And this is one of the ways that they're seeking to do that. They are suggesting Livermore develop an W80-4 ALT for the submarine launched cruise missile. So far, President Biden has said no. President Biden does not want to move forward with a sea-launched cruise missile. Yet Congress has decided to give money to it, to Livermore, for the last 3 years in a row. We were there saying, please do not give money to Livermore. And there's actually some traction because the long-range standoff warhead, the regular W80-4, has been delayed. And so now they might need to use a different warhead if they want to move forward with the sea-launched cruise missile anytime soon. All the we're moving forward with so many nuclear projects simultaneously that everything is getting delayed. And the agency literally can't spend money fast enough. They cannot hire enough people. They do not have the facilities in place to develop weapons as quickly as Congress is asking them to. So they're having to come up with alternative plans. And thus, this particular warhead is vulnerable to being cut until there's a more rational plan for moving forward with it, or just it can be cut. So that's what we were there arguing. And there is potentially some momentum there. The next one that I'm going to talk about is a much bigger program, and that's the Sentinel Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. We currently have something called the Minuteman III, or that's the name of our intercontinental ballistic missile. These are the ground-based strategic deterrent missiles that are in silos in states across kind of the middle of the country. They are on average about 40 years old, and the agency and Congress are arguing we need all new ones. So we need new silos, new missiles, and new warheads to replace everything that is there. To do so is going to be simultaneously the largest project happening in the Department of Defense and NNSA altogether. It's going to also be hugely expensive. The warhead portion is being developed at Livermore. It's called the W87-1. And what's important to note about that warhead is that Livermore early on decided they could not refurbish or reuse an existing warhead that we have. Instead, they need an all-new warhead that has a special plutonium pit and a special uranium secondary like none that's ever been in our stockpile. And that makes it a brand new nuclear weapon. This would be the first brand new nuclear weapon we've developed since the end of the Cold War. And it's going to require us to also build a new plutonium pit production plant. And that's going to be in Savannah River, South Carolina. And that facility alone, which we're going to build so that we can build new plutonium pits for the Sentinel, that facility is going to cost $25 billion, making it the most expensive building ever built in the United States, just so it can build 800 new plutonium pits for the Sentinel missile. It's a huge waste of money. It's also a huge danger. The last time we built plutonium pits, it was at a facility called Rocky Flats in Colorado. And you may have heard of that facility because to this day, it's the only government operated facility that was shut down by another branch of the government for crimes. The FBI shut down Rocky Flats in 1989 for environmental crimes, and it never reopened. And we stopped doing any work there, and it was a massive cleanup operation. Many employees were contaminated by plutonium there and made ill and died, and it is got a really crazy history. I'll recommend a book about it when I wrap up, but it's never has any country produced plutonium pits safely. They are arguing we can do that again, despite the fact, by the way, that we have 20,000 excess plutonium pits stored at Pantex plant in Texas. We have already all the Minutemen III that have W787-0 warheads in them that are perfectly fine. They could be, they call it life extended, but instead we've decided to move forward with this very expensive, very dangerous program that requires all new manufacturing. And it's part of what I mentioned earlier, nuclear weapons forever. It's because the United States wants to maintain the capability forever to produce nuclear weapons, to design new nuclear weapons. So it's a big shift. It's a huge shift from just 10 years ago. It's a huge shift from the Obama administration's posture that we were not going to develop new nuclear weapons, despite, he called it modernizing nuclear weapons, which was already a huge additional investment in these weapons. But we are now taking it a major step further. And it's happening right here at Livermore. So I just also want to mention part of why ICBMs, this Sentinel missile, is so dangerous. They are on a 7-minute alert situation. So if the president gets there, it's automatically notified that there's been some reason why we should respond with an ICBM, and the president has 7 minutes to make the decision of whether or not to launch all of those in response or not. So they are the most risky part of the nuclear triad out of the submarines, airplanes, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. And they're also redundant because we have the capability with other parts of the triad to do basically the same thing. Our submarines carry intercontinental or ballistic missiles that do the same mission. Also, the submarines can remain secret in the ocean, whereas the silos are not a secret and potentially result in a whole bunch of areas of the United States getting bombed by an adversary. So they're a gruesome, very 20th century version of nuclear posturing. And the fact that we're doubling down on it is alarming. Valley Cares is suing the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration to not build the plutonium pit manufacturing plant that I mentioned. We're suing them under environmental laws, arguing that they didn't do a thorough enough environmental review of the risks posed by that facility. That lawsuit has reached its merits phase, so we've recently briefed it, and they've replied. We get one more response, and then it will go to the judge for a decision. So stay tuned for more on that. And next, actually, that's really the most of the content that I wanted to give you guys. I wanted to save time for questions and talk about how people can get involved. which is a little bit easier to listen to. I know it's kind of like this stuff is pretty dark and complicated and in the weeds, but I really appreciate you guys being willing to hear about it. So does anyone have any questions about what I said so far? Can raise a hand or just ask.
Yes, you can actually, anybody who has a question can go to their reactions icon on the bottom of their screen and hit the raised hand. And we'll see you up, but your image will appear with a raised hand over it on the upper left part of the screen. And there's Cheryl with a question. But you're muted, Cheryl.
How do you get past this darkness of this whole issue?
One thing that's really been inspiring me, well, let me start by saying Daniel Ellsberg was a huge inspiration. And his involvement with Tri-Valley Cares, his deep dive into the issue. One of the things I was going to do at the end is recommend some books, but his book, Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, it is deeply affecting, and I recommend it. And you know, his shift from working at RAND and doing active nuclear war planning and what he learned and his dedication, you know, he dedicated the bulk of his life to this issue and putting his body on the line for it. And there is an amazing history of people speaking out and really making a difference. We had 30,000 nuclear weapons, and we are down to a much smaller number, 1,550 deployed nuclear weapons in the United States, 1,550 in Russia. And that is because of the people. It is because people joined together and made their governments take action and brought sense to those entities. And the history of this, the fact that a people-led movement made this impact before, you know, we didn't get all the way there to abolishing nuclear weapons and creating a verifiable regime of where nuclear weapons could be permanently abolished. But I'm encouraged by the fact that we've done this before, that there is, you know, a major history to stand on. I was going to also share we are going to have a Daniel Ellsberg small event out in Livermore. And I was going to share it because the flyer has a nice picture on it.
Is it this coming week, Scott, or is it a time after that?
It is this coming week.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah, so there it is. So that's a picture of Daniel and his wife Patricia at one of our August action events at the gates of the lab. We do a die-in, so we do like an alarm that's a fake nuclear weapon explosion, and people die in the street, and then the security has to ask those people to remove them. So here they are demonstrating during the die-in. You know, Livermore being the company town that it is, the main plaza is called Livermorium Plaza, sponsored by Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And so we are going to be at that plaza, which, by the way, is right across the street from the corporate office of Lawrence Livermore National Security, LLC, which is the private entity that manages Livermore Lab, made up of a consortium of weapons contractors and the University of California. And so we'll be out there with signs and out there doing a vigil with a table, and folks from Tri-Valley Cares bringing, you know, a different message than that plaza provides about the work at the lab. And anybody's welcome to join us from 4 to 6 on Tuesday.
What was the name of the book again? What was the name of that book?
Daniel Ellsberg's book is called Doomsday Machine.
Oh, okay.
It's in the chat, Cheryl.
Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner.
Okay.
Okay. Why don't we move on to Analoy? You're muted, Analoy. Unmute yourself and fire off your question. Great.
Okay. Well, first of all, Scott, thank you so much for a really impressive amount of information you have in your head. I really appreciate it. If I understood even a part of what you were saying, it sounds like that there'll be a whole lot more material that have to be decommissioned. Is that correct with all these new weapons coming on board? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, definitely. So what's going to happen is retirement of existing weapons.
Right.
So if we use the Sentinel as an example, the Minutemen III warheads will get retired. Their plutonium pits, their uranium secondaries, the tritium inside will all be sent to the Pantex plant in Texas. That's where nuclear weapons go to retire. And simultaneously, we are taking, we have thousands of tons of surplus plutonium in the nuclear weapons program that belongs to the National Nuclear Security Administration. So they are taking that plutonium to make brand new pits, a process which also creates nuclear waste. So when we make new pits, they have to run the plutonium through acids, and then you get plutonium contaminated acid, and there's shavings, there's all sorts of radioactive waste will be created. Our current weapons waste, if it's mid-level waste, goes to the WIP facility, which is the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in Carlsbad, New Mexico, which is the only geological repository for mid-level nuclear waste and low-level waste in the country. It's just for weapons waste. One of the problems that we identified in our lawsuit is that the plans are to create much more waste than WIP has a permit for. And so the agency is just saying, well, we'll deal with that when the time comes. But the truth is there's a limited capacity for that waste at WIP. By the way, that despite being sold as a facility that would never have a release, they've already had two at WIP since it started operating in 1999, including one that shut the facility down for 3 years and contaminated several dozen employees inside severely. So that was a long-winded answer to yes, you're absolutely right.
So is there any kind of projected locations for where new pits might be placed around the country?
The current plan is to put silos right next to the existing silos. And so those states are Colorado, Montana, South Dakota. I think there's like 3 or 4 more. But the pits themselves are going to be built mostly at Savannah River Site, South Carolina. They're also going to be doing a smaller number at Los Alamos. So the side note for that is that this plan will involve shipping plutonium waste, shipping surplus plutonium around, shipping pits back and forth across the country, a huge increase in the shipment of radioactive material on US highways.
Thanks. Thank you.
Before I get to Teresa, I'll mention that you can also put your questions in the chat, and Joan actually wanted to confirm that the June 11th event will just be an in-person event. I don't know if there's any virtualness to it or anything like that.
It is just a in-person event on June 11th.
Okay. Teresa. But you're muted.
I know, I had to look for the button or the icon. Then I can lower the hand now too. You mentioned the suit of suing the DOD, as somebody who has sued the DOD for something else once. Tell me a little bit where you are in the process of that, or what is the suit against, and the
Absolutely.
timeline, and etc.
So we're actually suing the DOE because
DOE, okay.
the Department of Energy's sub-autonomous agency, the National Nuclear Security Administration,
Right.
is the agency that's in charge of nuclear weapons development and operates Livermore Lab and operates Los Alamos, etc. The lawsuit is being brought, and by the way, Tri-Valley Cares is a co-plaintiff along with the Nuclear Watch New Mexico and Savannah River Site Watch. And we're suing because we joined suit because Livermore is supporting plutonium pit production. In other words, they're designing the systems for how plutonium pits will be produced. The actual production, however, will take place at Los Alamos and at Savannah River Site. But Livermore's designing it because they're designing the warhead that will be produced in those two sites. They will build 800 warheads for the W87-1 over the course of 10 years of operation. And then theoretically, they'll be available to do a different weapon. The lawsuit is being brought under the National Environmental Policy Act, under NEPA, because they did an environmental review at Savannah River Site, and they did one at Los Alamos. They did nothing around Livermore's support work, and they did nothing around the transport of radioactive material around the country for this program. And they didn't look at the proliferation impacts, and they didn't look at many aspects of having multiple sites work at this. They just looked at the impacts at the two sites independently. So we're arguing that a programmatic environmental impact statement that looks at this whole program, which is our interpretation of what's required under NEPA, be conducted before they move forward with what they're calling the two-site solution.
I have a follow-up. Mike has another question first.
Now let's go to Mike and
Go
then
ahead,
we can
Teresa.
get back to you.
No, Teresa, go ahead.
Semi-related to that, and so part of the mechanism, the structure is the DOE is the oversight of all all the safety, et cetera. I'm condensing quite a bit of what all the various governmental structures do. As I have been reading, like sorry to bring politics into this, but Trump's plan 2025 with the intention of sort of like reducing all of the what would you call it, the governmental state, and that really includes all of the oversight of any type of health, but any type of safety, and in all the highways, etc. Do you have I guess a comment or on that?
I absolutely do. The interesting thing about nuclear weapons is part of why in terms of governmental structure, part of why the Department of Energy created a sub-autonomous agency within itself around 2005 was so that the Department of Energy could have do its own oversight, which it always did, but they kind of broke up the agency so that DOE has its own oversight over NNSA. There's entities like the Office of Safety and Transportation within DOE, and that's the only entity that has oversight authority over the transportation of nuclear waste related to weapons in the country. There's the NRC, but the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, just has oversight over commercial nuclear power and spent fuel, et cetera. They have no authority over the weapons-related nuclear material. The only outside authority exists in a very small agency called the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, which is just that. It's a board, and it has actually no true regulatory authority. It can only make recommendations, but it's the only outside governmental organization outside the DOE that can go on site at these facilities, has clearance, and can monitor and see what's happening and write reports and make recommendations. And I will mention that we learned in Washington that that board doesn't have a quorum, and Republicans want to not fund it and not give new board members, which could make it completely ineffective starting in October. So we're working on that. Yeah, this year. Yeah, it's one of the things we're working on. There'll be an action alert on our website in the next week about that. But yeah, there's honestly not a great regulatory system around nuclear weapons, partly because they were developed in an atmosphere of secrecy, and there's high levels of clearance involved, and that therefore the agency, it's the hen guarding the hen, or the rooster guarding the hen house, whatever that saying is. DOE self-regulates around
Fox guarding the house.
Yeah, thank you. Fox guarding the hen house.
Okay. Mike, what do you got?
Yeah, but I saw Stephen, were you raising your finger earlier, or was that something else? I don't want to jump in front of you. Oh, no, okay. Yeah, I'm just looking at all this new warheadism. Doesn't all that stuff require real life testing? I mean, I'm just curious that they're so assured of how they've been making them all along. They really don't have to go blow anything up to make sure it works, or just
Mike, that question is so on point. I wasn't kind of going there because it's a little in the weeds, but one of the reasons why so far our modernization of nuclear weapons that we've been doing since the Obama administration has been called just modernization is because we've not wanted to move beyond the tested weapon in the stockpile. So we've been kind of doing work around that to just change components. And then we've tested that in both what are called non-critical tests, subcritical tests at Nevada Test Site in the tunnels. And we've got the National Ignition Facility at Livermore Lab, which is a laser-based facility that tests nuclear material. Supposedly, we've been able to maintain the surety and reliability of the existing stockpile and these newly modernized weapons with those two pathways: supercomputers, NIF, and subcritical tests. Newly altered nuclear primaries and secondaries in nuclear weapons changes the fundamentals that all of the supercomputing and NIF data is based on. And it inherently is going to introduce problems. It's going to introduce variation that very likely will mean when the time comes to start certifying new Sentinel weapons to go into the stockpile, the agency is going to argue that it needs to increase the yield in the testing it's doing at Nevada Test Site. And we are simultaneously upgrading Nevada Test Site to start doing full criticality tests in the tunnels again. So I'll remind people, we are We have never ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. The United States has just observed the treaty. So we could at any moment decide to get back to full-scale underground testing at Nevada Test Site. And the Sentinel would give us a good reason to do so because of its new nuclear components.
I'm just stunned that knowing money is so short, even for the Pentagon. I mean, they're always belly aching. That just the philosophy of nuclear war fighting that I think Daniel Ellsberg mentioned, I think earlier on in one of his writings, that they haven't really upgraded the philosophy behind it. Like, the first strike, second strike, weapons there just to absorb the first strike, on and on. None of them can happen without ending civilization, basically, with all what we know now. And I'm just stunned that they're willing to throw that kind of money into basically a pit in the ground, knowing none of it can really be used. And it just kind of stuns me. That's all. I'll leave it at that. You can certainly comment on that, but it's absolutely.
Let's go to Lynn now.
Crazy, yeah.
Hi, my computer kicked me off for a while.
Oh.
So
Glad you made it
yeah, what an impressive talk. Wow. So did anyone ask where all the nuclear weapons are and how many there are currently? Is that what you mean by the stockpile?
Yes, and you mean just US nuclear weapons?
Yeah, in America, in the US territory.
We have intercontinental ballistic ground missiles in 5 states. And
That have nuclear warheads?
yeah, in silos in the ground. And then we also have submarines. We have submarines have ballistic missiles on them, and there are currently 2 submarine bases in the US that have those submarines. But if we go forward with that submarine launch cruise missile I mentioned, those would be on an attack class submarine, and we would have to add new bases that can have attack class submarines with nuclear weapons on them. By the way, one of those being floated is San Diego, and there has already been some opposition to letting nuclear armed submarines into San Diego's base there. So that might be a point of opposition to build on. But then we also have airplanes with bombers or with nuclear weapons on them. So those are on aircraft carriers. There are also some that are on at US bases. And then we also have many in NATO bases in Europe.
Can I ask one more quick question?
We have one from George, and then we'll go back to, and then
okay.
I want to go through something on the chat, and then we'll go back to you.
I'm just gonna turn the light on in my house because I'm getting to be in the dark. Give me one.
We pause for
All right, thanks.
convenience. Okay, now you can see us. Okay, George.
My apologies for my tardiness. I know you mentioned intermediate nuclear missiles. Someone talked about the idea of that, they don't plan to use them or they can't use them. But in fact, right, with intermediate nuclear missiles, right, that speaks more readily to their use. I mean, the one point I want to make about that, and I'm assuming, and perhaps I'm wrong, you didn't mention this, is that the reason the United States is developing intermediate nuclear missiles, at least is the understanding, is that now the American Navy is very vulnerable to missile attacks. So even hundreds of miles out to sea, the Chinese can knock out American aircraft carriers. And so the thought is that, instead of thinking, okay, war is obsolete, the idea is we are going to threaten, if you knock out our aircraft carriers and our other naval assets, we're going to respond with intermediate nuclear missiles. And the United States withdrew from the intermediate nuclear missile treaty. So far from thinking that they're not going to use nuclear missiles, I mean, the American military is actually actively incorporating them in their strategy, not as a weapon of last resort, but as something to use in the context of so-called regular warfare? Thank you.
Yes, I would just add to that, the other only remaining bilateral treaty around nuclear weapons with Russia is the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that was negotiated in 2008 and ratified following that. It expires in 2026. And following that, we will be in a situation where we do not have any bilateral treaty. We really have no nuclear weapons treaties. That will be the first time in 30 years. And both nations and China are preparing to be out of that treaty at this point and build up the number of weapons that we have in the stockpile, in addition to the types of weapons. Looks like you had another comment, George.
Actually, there's something in the chat that I wanted to sort of relay.
Go ahead, please. Go
to George. So and it's from Cheryl Spencer, who is very active in WILP, talking about how she was at the Vandenberg Air Force Base, or I guess now they're calling it the Vandenberg Space Force Base, who can keep up these days, back on Thursday. Thank you very much for doing that. And this is part of the protest against the test launch of an ICBM, in which an ICM is trucked in from a silo in the Midwest to launch. And when the ICBM lands near the Marshall Islands, the question is, do they recover it and send it back to the Midwest, or are we depleting the number of silos that have missiles in them? Also adding that she read a military article that says they have 300 test launches over, well, I don't know, 10, 20, 30 years, something like that. How did they keep up the 400 ICBMs in the Midwest? I would think they keep building them, but what's your thought, Scott?
My impression, or what my understanding, is that we have many in reserve that are, every ICBM that's in a silo has a matching one in reserve that can be exchanged, fairly quickly. And so those are the ones that we shoot out of Vandenberg. Also, that program, because we're redoing it with the Sentinel missile, is going to rapidly change, and we'll be testing way more missiles once those are developed, but they're over costs, over budget, and having scheduling delays. So that might be a while, but yeah, it's very dangerous given the current international climate to be testing weapons, but all the countries are doing it.
Okay.
So can I just, because this really struck me, because I was looking in the web for photographs, because we didn't see the famous arc of the ballistic missile going up. We only saw some flashes in the sky as its secondary rocket fired off. And I thought to myself, so I found this military by military people, a video that shows you them picking up a missile from the Midwest and trucking it across the country to Vandenberg, where they have a special silo they've built there for the test launches. And somewhere I read that in that article that they've done this 300 times. They do it 4 times a year, and they've done it for several decades. So I don't know where they got the 300, but anyway, I said to myself, so we used to have 400 of these. Are they depleting them by trucking them and sending them off to the Marshall Islands? But you're saying, in fact, we have more than 400. There's 400 silos got the missiles in them, but they've got some reserve nearby in the Midwest.
What's your thought on that?
Yeah.
I believe that we used to have more like 1,200 missile silos, and part of the treaty negotiation, both in the New START treaty and before, was to close a bunch of existing silos. And so I think a lot of the missiles could be from closed silos, because what we do is we close the silo, but then we truck the missile and we remove the warhead. Warhead goes to Pantex, missile goes somewhere else, but we maintain both in a state of readiness. So undergoing constant maintenance at a very large expense, by the way, to be ready to be put back into the stockpile at any moment in case they needed to be. So that's also where the kind of surplus of Minutemen III missiles is coming from. But my understanding is we're not producing more Minutemen III missiles at this point. We're now shifting over to the Sentinel program. So, you know, it does seem like a Sentinel isn't going to make it into the stockpile for 10 years. So if we're continuing with this level for the next 10 years, you know, I could be wrong. Maybe we are still producing some Sentinel missiles, but yeah, I'm not sure we can keep
The Minuteman,
testing them.
yeah.
Right.
Well, thank
Okay.
you for telling me about the 1200. I didn't know that, and so that would be a source for these. So what? Just to explain, if people
Well,
didn't know.
Cheryl, I'm sorry. Let's go back to George, and then we'll come back to you because sounds like you got some other good thoughts.
Thank you very much. I mean, one point I'll simply make, I want to make 2 points. One point I'll make is that my understanding is that the bulk of the American nuclear missiles are on submarines. Again, that's my understanding. And yes, there are many on constant flyovers in terms of B-52 and like bombers that are constantly in the air.
We don't constantly fly B-52s anymore, thankfully.
Oh, not anymore. Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. I appreciate it. But one point I wanted to really quickly make, and I think this is really the point I was really raising my hand for, is that, you know, just was it yesterday, day before yesterday, someone in the national security leadership position talked about expanding the number of American nuclear weapons, and you know, it's fascinating because you know, ultimately American foreign policy is what really is driving places like China to build up their nuclear missile stockpile, driving North Korea towards a nuclear missile, driving Iran towards a nuclear missile. And then the United States uses that to then justify expanding further and further destabilizing the question of nuclear missiles.
Yeah.
And so, you know, the United States uses the fact that Russia talks about, look, you know, if the West expands this war further, that nuclear missiles are on the agenda. They use that to justify building more missiles and expanding the stockpile. And so, you know, one is left with the Dr. Strangelove kind of thinking, which is that, you know, where does this end, right? And it just seems beyond sanity. And so, again, American policy is destabilizing the situation, leading to more nuclear-powered states, and leading to much greater likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons and their escalation, of course, to worldwide Armageddon. So thank you very much. I appreciate your comments, Scott.
Yeah, I think the only thing, you're exactly right, George. And one thing I would add is it seems, and I've heard members of Congress staff talk about that, it seems like one of the theories is that at some point, China or Russia will decide it's too expensive to compete. And you know, I think there's some piece of it that's the United States invented these weapons. We're still the only country to have used them in war, and we need to be the biggest nuclear arms entity in the room, kind of thing. You know, that posture has never really changed, even though at times Russia's had more weapons, total number. We've always had more systems. And yes, right now, all of the three major nuclear powers are moving forward with new systems and planning to have more actual weapons in the stockpile at some point. I do have like some closing remarks, so I know we're getting over time. We were just going to 8, is that right?
I figured 8:30, but if you're running out of time, you let us know.
I'm not. I have time. I just wanted to make sure.
Okay.
May I jump in here?
Actually, Jim, we have, you know, I will consider your hand raised, but we have Lynn, and then I think Cheryl had some other thoughts, and we'll go to Jim.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So didn't Trump kick us out of the Iran deal? And did Biden get us back in? Or are we still, that's deal is over?
It's out. Over.
Yes, that deal is over.
And the other question is, what do you think? Putin keeps threatening nuclear. Do you think he means it, or is it just a ploy?
Gosh, I hope he doesn't use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. It's alarming for the United States to decide that we will allow Ukraine to shoot US weapons, non-nuclear US weapons into Ukraine. That's a very aggressive move.
Into Russia, yeah.
Into Russia, sorry, for Ukraine to shoot US weapons into Russia. Sorry about that. So it's a step in escalation. This is how things escalate toward a nuclear exchange.
Okay, Cheryl, did you have a follow-up to your follow-up?
Just to make sure that everybody here understood, the purpose of these test launches that they do from Vandenberg 4 times a year is to prove that the missiles still work, because they are old and they're using old electronics and so on and so forth. So they had one last November which didn't work. They had to blow it up midway, okay, or soon after it left. They realized it wasn't going to work. So they, which of course is they could use now as an excuse. Well, look, they're so old, they don't work very well. So that's why we need 400 new Sentinels, as they call them. So, but so then they got behind and so we had 2 launches in 1 week. And you can find pictures that the military puts out, videos, by Googling it and showing the various stages of the rockets. And then they go to the Marshall Islands where they land, and the Marshall Islands, the people of the Marshall Islands, including, they have somebody called their king, gets a whole bunch of money for letting the US military land these missiles near the Marshall Islands, which of course is where in the 50s and 60s we did all the testing of nuclear weapons above ground and below, and completely ruined a lot of the islands there. So that's why, so the Marshallese won't speak out against the launchers because they're making money for allowing the missiles to land there. What I can't find out from anybody is, do they actually recover them, or are there's a bunch of missiles sitting on the seafloor near the Marshall Islands? Do you
Scott,
know,
you know anything
Scott?
about that?
I don't know the answer to that. I do know we do have a military base in the Marshall Islands. Part of the exchange that the Marshallese made in exchange for their independence was to allow for continued missile testing and continued military presence of the US in the Marshall Islands. Yeah, and the history of that is gruesome, and I encourage people to learn about it.
Okay, so let's go to Jim and then back to George.
Yeah, Scott, this is really eye-opener. I appreciate it so much. I sort of stumbled into this meeting, as a few of you at the beginning maybe heard, but I appreciate so much what you've covered here. I've certainly watched the international diplomacy and what's going on in this whole area of arms control or out of control. And you've really brought it up to date, because I haven't had any involvement in this for a number of years now. Even though when, of course, if we have a nuclear exchange, we would all agree at that point, if we're alive, that this was the #1 issue for the human race and Earth. But there's so many connections here. When I saw Tri-Validated Cares, I had no idea what it was, but I would like to learn more about what you and your organization are doing. And then I thought it was more of a local thing there in Livermore, which is very interesting. But there's so many other connections here. I do have, there's a fellow I know, fraternity brother, classmate from college, who is now living up near Alamo and does talk still, I think. And I could put you in touch with him. You might want to speak to his group. When he worked at Livermore, as it turns out, after graduation from MIT. And so there's that connection. He would love to, yeah, I can put you in touch with him. And then the other connections along the way, I just think of all these different programs. You think of the ABM treaty, Nixon and Reagan and so forth going on. I grew up, one connection is I grew up in, my hometown is Grand Forks, North Dakota. And you may recall that under that ABM treaty, the location that we were able to protect, I think we could protect two, as I recall it, and we picked Washington and then Grand Forks, North Dakota, because of all the military stuff there, the Air Force Base, the Minuteman wing there, Air Defense Command, the SAC bombers, B-52s, and all that going on. I remember seeing these silos there. I'd be interested in knowing what the current state of that is. There's just so many connections. I love it. And you talked about the lab maybe publicizing more the more peaceful side of what they do. And I have been involved more on that side of it, fusion energy, which has really been, that's the real wild card. If that really comes to fruition, and I think it's increasingly likely probability that will make a real big difference in energy production, it's clean energy and so forth. And I know the lab there had a breakthrough in terms of some milestone that they passed. So you might be interested in looking at that. But I can see where Lawrence Livermore would like to promote that fusion side of it. And by the way, that is totally non-radioactive. It's totally safe. You could blow up one of these fusion things when they finally get going, and all it'll do is stop. No radioactive material, nothing. So I don't know, I'm just, this is really great. You brought me up to date on so many things here, and I could go down the list. I think of Vandenberg, I took Boy Scouts down there and went down in the silo. That was very interesting. So a lot to talk about. I just appreciate so much this group, and Scott, what you're doing, let's connect. There's, see where it goes.
Okay. So Jim, there's Scott just put in a link to TriValleyCares.org and specifically what was going on with the DC days, the lobbying that was going on a couple of weeks ago. So you can click that and check it all out too. And in fact, and from there you can go just to the general website of TriValleyCares.org.
Yep.
Scott, any other thoughts
From
what Jim said?
Not really. I could talk about the National Ignition Facility. It's kind of like a big thing to talk about. I do know they have had breakthroughs after many years and lots of billions of dollars. Not sure that the fusion energy model they're going with has much commercial application. It does have a scientific, element to it. So, the future will tell. I will mention that it does have a nuclear weapons scientific pursuit to it, the same facility, the National Ignition Facility. It's how they test nuclear material that they take out of the stockpile. They use it to model. It does have that element to it. It's got some controversy, but that's kind of a big other topic. So why don't we move on to Greg?
So we have George and Teresa, and then we'll see if we have
George.
time for anything else,
Yeah,
if anybody else has anything else.
Thank you. Couple quick questions, couple quick comments. Cheryl, to your question about whether they retrieve the missiles, I assume that's classified, but they have to retrieve the missiles. Stands to reason for two reasons. First and foremost, for analytical purposes, right? You want to study the missiles after they've been fired to see how they operate, et cetera, and so forth. And the other issues that you don't want to get, you don't want to allow the Chinese or the Russians to get them. To the best that you can collect them, I think they do try to collect everything they can, again, if nothing else, for simply intelligence purposes, or to prevent other countries from, again, gleaning this technology for whatever purposes they might deem necessary or useful. The other point I want to make, just very quickly, is that on this issue of Russia, just because, again, and I know I commented on it, and there was a couple of comments about why Russia is threatening nuclear missiles. I mean, it's important to know that on the face of it, American policy is to destabilize Russia. And so that in and of itself, is really pointing towards the use of nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons, right? In other words, if the country is destabilized, that makes nuclear missiles simply much more likely to be used because the leadership is going to see its life on the line, et cetera, and so forth. So it really is a disturbing policy to engage war against Russia, to fire missiles at its territory, something that would have been considered completely unimaginable during the Cold War. And so the fact that we're at this point, again, we're back at sort of the Dr. Strangelove point, which is like, again, a willingness to use nuclear weapons, or a willingness to see them used. So, that point needs to be stressed in terms of American policymakers really, what's the word I'm looking for? Really tempting fate, and really no less, tempting fate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would just add that part of what's additionally baffling about it, or difficult about it, is we're tempting fate in Europe, that this is really increasing the likelihood of a nuclear exchange in Europe between NATO countries with US nuclear weapons and Russia. But our hand in that is very apparent. Go ahead, Teresa.
Thank you. These paired questions may be a softball-y type thing for you. And you were talking about actually, this is in my head before you even wrote down about your lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. Do you present to, let's say, high schoolers in college, and then you've also spoken right now to the to the DC law, to the staffers who are, like they're about 22 years old too. Exactly. Compare and contrast the questions you get asked, your reactions to them, or their reactions to you, I meant to say. And that's in general. But then a related question is, what do you consider, maybe there's two or three things. What are the actions that you consider to be the most effective things that we citizens, including high schoolers, including junior high schools, and your Boy Scouters and your 22-year-olds, staffers in DC, what are the actions that are most effective?
First off, people under 40 did not learn in school anything about the US nuclear weapons stockpile, very little about nuclear history. They learn about the end of the Cold War. They learn about it as history, and very little knowledge exists for young people about anything that I talked about.
Until Oppenheimer, maybe.
Until Oppenheimer, maybe. Yeah, a good point. And so it's been a point of awakening that is helpful. And since then, there's a student group that's been kind of catching on rapidly called Students for Nuclear Disarmament, I want to say. And they're doing a great job of connecting high school students with experts. Not that I'm necessarily an expert, but people in the field, to go and talk to them in schools. And so that's been a great development. So, I would just say educating themselves is first and foremost the thing that they should do. And, climate change has really sucked up a lot of the air in terms of what young people have focused on. And I think that's changing a little bit, but hopefully it starts to change more. I do go and speak as much as I can to student groups, and I love getting an invitation to speak. I always take it. But that we have a long way to go. And, I would say millennials are kind of a missing generation, like really don't have a lot of awareness around the nuclear issue. And
then those 22 or those, up to 35-year-old staffers. How was it? What was your reception? The staffers, and I guess maybe the actual congressional,
Well, we try to be fairly targeted and meet with staffers who are working for Congress people on relevant committees to the issue. So we tend to get the most educated staffers on these issues, and still there's a lot of both misinformation to kind of grapple with. Oh, thank you for putting Students for Disarmament in the chat. That is them. I think have very little awareness. They hear very little from the disarmament and nuclear abolition community. Since the entire nuclear weapons complex was privatized and is now managed by private entities since 2006, they do hear from lots of lobbyists who represent weapons contractors who are going into Congress and lobbying for increased nuclear weapons funding and more programs, and hyping the threat from our adversaries, and that they can provide the solution if they get the checks. There's a huge amount of money involved in the nuclear weapons stockpile, and since privatization, there's a huge number of lobbyists working on nuclear weapons forever. So we going there, especially voices from the community, are typically the only people these staffers ever hear from with our perspective. So it's important work to do. There is a strong DC based abolition community who does lobbying. I don't want to say that it doesn't exist, but they are not from the communities. They come from a broader perspective. You know, we were there also talking about nuclear safety and transportation and lots of the kind of nitty-gritty on the ground issues around having a nuclear weapons complex that they don't hear a lot about. That said, you know, I think that we have a long way to go in both ways.
Mm-hmm.
You think of the election coming up.
Wait, we got one more question, sorry, and then
I'm sorry, how you work this.
I was
Go ahead.
just going to say the
yeah.
oversight of a
And we're
private
kind of-
company is much more
yeah.
difficult than
Teresa, sorry.
oversight done to the federals.
Yeah. So Cheryl, you will have the last question.
Scott, do you have any connections with workers in the plants?
Yeah, so I actually represent workers made ill by on-the-job exposure to get benefits and some compensation. I don't necessarily do that because we want to. I do that for justice for the workers and to build relationships, and it's resulted in having access to whistleblowers and workers that are concerned about safety issues, workers that are noticing things that are not going right, whether it's waste, fraud, abuse, nuclear safety issue, all of that. It's really opened for us doing the work representing workers has really helped us to be to have more information and get kind of a better relationship with workers. So yes.
Oh, that's encouraging. Great to hear. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for asking the question. In closing, I just would like to tell people you can go to our website, and if you scroll down to the bottom, there's a Join Us page. Our box. You can put your email in there. You'll get our email alerts. So we tend to send 1 to 2 emails a month with an action item that people can take. So for example, right now, there's the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act for downwinders of nuclear tests, specifically in New Mexico, but also elsewhere that weren't initially covered. That act is set to expire. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, is sitting on the bill and not allowing it to go to a vote, even though we know we have the votes to pass the bill. So we are asking people from around the country to call Speaker Johnson about that. I offer it mainly as an example of the kind of things that we have as action items that you get emailed. So it's something you can do to get involved on this issue. We also have a monthly meeting. It's virtual, and you can find out about that on our website if you want to join. It's the third Thursday of every month at 7:30, and it's just for an hour. We talk about these issues. We talk about planning stuff and events. And speaking of events, we have the annual August Hiroshima Nagasaki commemoration that will be happening at the west gate of the lab, which is on Vasco Road and Westgate Avenue. It will be a rally and a nonviolent direct action Patricia Ellsberg is one of our speakers, as well as Norman Solomon, as well as myself. And we also have a filmmaker from Japan coming who just created a great movie that we're going to be screening in Oakland and Berkeley on August 9th and 10th, called Silent Fallout. That's about nuclear testing in the United States. He was shocked to know that we exploded 106 nuclear weapons in Nevada and the atmosphere on our own people. So he made a movie about that and about the impacts that followed. But our Nagasaki Hiroshima Day is on August 6th, which is the 79th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima, and it is at 9 o'clock at Vasco and Westgate Avenue in Livermore in front of the gates. So I hope to see some of you there.
And we are in the habit of publicizing the Hiroshima Day activities that Tri-Valley Cares does. So we will continue that tradition. And I thank you very much, Scott, for your time. And I thank all of you who were participants who came to be here for your time. A little further up in the chat is the link to the to Daniel Ellsberg Week. It says diffusenuclearwar.org/Ellsberg, and you can find out what other activities are going on. I'm sure some of those are virtual as well, but either way, it's interesting to see what's going on to honor Daniel Ellsberg. So I bid everybody a very good rest of your night and a very good next week. And we'll see you doing something or another next month, I'm sure.
Thanks so much for having me, everyone. Really nice to meet you all, and
Thanks, Scott.
thanks for listening.
Thank you.
Signed up.